Okay. So hello, everybody. It's not a big group. I hope you find something useful in the talk today. I'm just going to basically be going over the T3010. So I had Anna Marie use her online skills and come up with a nice prayer that we could use that talks a little bit about money. So you're welcome to say this with me or to be on mute and just listen. Oh God, in your love, you have given the people of this land gifts of abundance beyond what our forebears know or could imagine. Mercifully grant that we may not be so occupied with material things that we forget spiritual gifts, and thus, even though we have gained the world, lose our souls. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. What I'm going through today basically is completing the T3010. As you probably know, I do want to go through a couple of payroll reminders and some record keeping reminders. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to let me know. I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat as well, but I might miss that while I'm doing the screen share. So don't hesitate to just unmute and say, hey, I need to know something extra here. Like I said, I will be recording this. It will be on the resources section on the Synod website, and we'll probably post the slides as well. Hopefully you find some good on that Synod website. We do try to have resources up there. And if there's anything you need added, like don't ever hesitate to say, I'd like you to have this available for me. I am going to cover the key points based on my experience and what I've done, what I've learned. But keep in mind that CRA always has the final say. So there's going to be more details on the CRA website should you need them. That's always going to be the ultimate authority. Why do we file the T3010, which is basically what replaces a tax return for charities? Because we're charities, we are able to issue donation receipts. Because people get donation receipts, they pay a little bit less tax. So in a way, we're being supported by all of the taxpayers in Canada. That means we have some responsibility to report and to do the things that a charity is supposed to be doing. We're not here to run clubs and sometimes we get attached to our buildings, but we're here for a reason. We're here to do God's work, but we're also accountable to the government. The filing deadline, 6 months after your year end. You get several letters. You've probably gotten a few of those already this year. If you don't file, you will eventually be, your charitable status will be revoked and you won't be able to issue donation receipts. No, they used to send out packages in the mail. They don't spend a lot of money mailing paper to people anymore, which is probably a good thing. So you need to either have your My Business account, or you need to have a Represent a Client account, or you can go and download the forms. Make sure you get the most recent copy because they do change those forms. The website will be a clickable link if you go to these slides after the fact. So don't feel that you have to write down that. What happens after you file, kind of the same thing as what happens after you file your tax return. CRA goes through it. They will send you a letter saying that they've received and filed it. If there's something that's wrong, i.e. if it's not signed or something like that, they will send it back to you and you may need to fix that and send it in again, and you still have to send it in by the deadline. If you've been on the CRA Charities website, you can see what information is publicly available. Again, because you're in a way accountable to all the taxpayers in Canada, that information is available on CRA's website. Things like your name, how long you've been registered, and your previous 4 years of T3010 information. You need to keep them for 7 years like you would any other financial records. So going through it line by line, the first thing it's going to ask you about is a basic information sheet that used to be the one you got with the stickers on the back of it. If you don't get that in the mail, you don't have to fill anything out. the identification, that's pretty straightforward, website address. I would say that you're not in a subordinate position to a head body. If you do use yes, that's the Saskatchewan registration number. Hopefully not wound up or dissolved, although time comes, I guess, for everyone. And no, if you're not a designated foundation. Directors and trustees. The board of directors is church council, and your pastor is likely ex officio. So those are the names you need to have on this. It's a good idea every single year to send a draft to your church council, one, so that they know, and they should be aware that this information is being collected by CRA, and the name and position, these things are publicly available. But their home address, their phone number, their birthday, that is just for CRA's use. They're not going to share that. That's not on a website anywhere. That is just for CRA. But your director should be checking it. They should be aware that you're sending it in, and they should be verifying that the information is correct. You're going to include everyone who served during the year. So if it's a December 31st year end and you had somebody who was done in March, you're still going to include them because they served during the year. If your AGM's in February and they didn't start until 2022, then they don't need to be on this one, but you're going to need that information for next year. So start date, end date, the position if they're an officer, home address, date, time, and the birth date is used by CRA to identify someone. If you don't put that on there, CRA is not going to reject it, but they do want you to attempt to get that information and include it. The arm's length can be a little bit confusing at times. If you have a council member who's related to anybody else on council, they are not at arm's length. That's not a problem, but you do need to check that no box. So if you have a married couple, they're not at arm's length. If you have a parent and child, they're not at arm's length. And it doesn't matter if they're related to each other, it just matters that they're related to somebody else on council. Programs and general information, you probably don't change this year to year unless you do have some new programs. It's pretty straightforward, but use active language and hit your charitable purpose. That's what you want to tell them. That's what you want to tell the public. Qualified donees, you can only, as a registered charity, you can only spend money on the charity that you do, except you can transfer funds to another registered charity. And of course, that all comes back to the tax law. If you've given someone a donation receipt, it's because you've promised the government you're doing charitable work, and that's why that person is getting a tax deduction. You can't turn around and then send that money to an organization that wouldn't have been able to receive them, but you could transfer it to another registered charity. The charity listings make it very easy to find out who's a registered charity, and you should check before you're sending out money, if that's something that you do. You want to include everything that every fund transfer, you want to list them. Associated charity is always going to be no. That's a very special thing that you would have written in and obtained special permission for. So that's going to be a no. That doesn't mean that you're not at arm's length. The business number you can find online, and that's the link where you can look up charities, and it doesn't allow you to put dollars and cents. And again, we're posting the slides, so you don't need to write down that address. You'll be able to click that link after the fact if you need it. I think most of C is straightforward. If you're sending money to CLWR, you're sending it in Canada. So you're probably and hopefully actually not sending money outside of the country. You need to have some special agreements in place if you're doing that, and CLWR would have that. But if you're sending it to CLWR, that's in Canada. Yeah, C6 is just a bunch of check boxes. That's going to be unique to you. C7 is only if you've actually hired a fundraiser, you probably would know if you had. C8 can be a little bit tricky because it asks whether you pay somebody who's a director. If you're paying your pastor, you probably hopefully are, and they're also on council, C8 is a yes. And C9 is a yes if you have payroll. And again, this is payroll employees, not other types of contractors. I think C10 is pretty straightforward. Compensation is the number of employees in box 300 is the number of permanent full-time employees. If that's just one, you just put a 1. And for those permanent full-time employees, you just need to put the number of them in each of the categories. That's all you're doing for the full-time employees. For the part-time employees, you just want the number of employees and the total amount altogether. And then 390 is the total of both of those dollar amounts. That's salary, allowances, benefits, your portion of CPP and EI, all of that. And that number that you put in box 390 also has to match to the one you put on your financial statement, where you put your financial information in. If you by chance got donations of goods, if somebody said, here, I've bought this, I'm giving it to the church, just give me a receipt, you would need to do some reporting here on that. There are special rules about receipting those types of gifts because they're not cash. If someone donates something and you reimburse them and they later give you a cash gift, that's a cash gift. But if they give you something that you're going to keep and use and you give them a receipt for it, then there's some special rules around that. And that includes stock shares if you get that. If someone does something for you, you cannot receipt that. It doesn't matter if that's a professional thing that they do that they would charge other people for and they don't charge you. You cannot receipt that. You cannot receipt any professional services or any time. If someone wants to donate time, then the only way to do that is if you pay them the services and they later put in a gift to your church of cash. C12, I think these are all pretty straightforward. Hopefully C14 is a no, because you should never be accepting money, receipting, and then forwarding the proceeds, no matter how good the cause, even if it's to a family from Ukraine who's coming here. You can't accept donations, receipt someone, and then pass the money on where you couldn't normally pass the money. Financial information, if you do have, there are some ELW groups still operating, which is great. There are some youth groups, things like that. If they're part of your charity, you can receipt the donations to them, but you also have to include their revenue, their expenses, their bank account in your reporting. They're part of your organization. So depending on your size, you're either going to be filling out section D or you're going to be filling out section 6 or schedule 6. Section D, of course, is a little bit more simplified, but you're basically giving them the same information. Cash basis, that means until it's in your bank, you don't record it. Until you send it out of your bank, you don't record it. Accrual basis is more time-based, which is generally the way accounting is done, but you don't have to do it that way. You can operate on a cash basis. Simple definitions of assets, liabilities, revenue, expenditures. Disbursement quota we'll talk about a bit later. Short-term meaning mature within the next fiscal year. Non-arm's length is anything like perhaps you give your pastor a loan to or to move to your location. That's a non-arm's length liability. If you invest in something that's somehow related, that's not arm's length. There's nothing wrong with that. You just need to report it. And always put the total value of your assets and then minus the accumulated amortization. So don't just put the net value. Property not used in charitable activities. If you're renting out your church basement to a for-profit business, a daycare or something like that, you're going to consider that property not used for charitable activities because it's not what you're doing, unless you want to consider that, like if it is a daycare, that might be something you consider part of your charitable activity. If you're renting it out to a for-profit, or if you have a parsonage, what used to be a parsonage, and you're renting it out for pay, that's property not used in charitable activities. So you need to put some kind of dollar amount on that and just report that that's not being used currently for charitable activities. Again, non-arm's length, that's employees, council members, pastor, anything that you're dealing with a related party. You don't need to issue charitable donation receipts to other charities. It's not wrong, but there's no reason to do it. Same typically with businesses, they need a receipt, but they don't need a donation receipt. They're not individuals filing a T1. And if you don't need to issue a donation receipt, then don't. Just send out a regular receipt. So into the financial information. Line 4510. I'm just going to flip. I believe that is, yeah, amounts received from other registered charities. So again, this would be separate from the tax receipted, assuming that you don't tax receipt it, and you don't need to. Anything if you got a Synod grant or something like that. Line 4540 is the federal government revenue, which is getting a lot more use than it used to a few years ago. But this is not where you would put GST rebates. This is where you put federal government subsidies or grants. Depending on how you deal with your GST, you can either, when you're recording your expense, you could record that 50% as a receivable right then, and then it never has to hit your income and expense statement. If you're recording the full expense, and then when you're getting the rebate, recording that as income, then that would be line 4650 is where you would put that as other income. Travel and vehicle can sometimes get a little messy if you're giving somebody an allowance. If you're paying your pastor or someone a flat monthly amount and they're not claiming mileage, that's part of their salary. You have to include that in their compensation. That's subject to deductions. If they're putting in mileage claims and it's a reasonable amount of mileage, it's what CRA considers reasonable, then that's a travel and vehicle expense, and that's not taxable to the employee or the person that's getting it. And things like the GSI portion of the continuing ed, that's part of compensation. That's not a training expense. 4950 is the total. The only thing separated from that is the gifts to other charities. And then they ask you to break down your total expenses. What is admin, what is for charity use. Fundraising, if you have a rental property, those costs are actually go in the fundraising section because they're used to generate income. If you want to categorize some as management and admin, that's very much a judgment call. The most important thing is be consistent year to year. If you're calling it what you pay your auditors and admin expense, then do that every year. If you're calling it part of your charitable purpose, because that is something you have to do as operating a charity, then just do that year to year. And there's no bright lines here. Although you should never be putting a whole lot into management and admin. This is not going to reflect well on your charity, and it's probably not correct. Gifts to qualified donees. So here's the money that you've transferred to other charities. If you send it through the Synod, you should probably be showing it as sent to the Synod, even if we're subsequently directing it to CLWR or the seminary or something else. But here's where you put the money that you send to us, and then you do the extra form, the T1236. And then that comes to your total expenses. Property not used in charitable activities for this part of Schedule 6. I've actually seen some organizations do things a little bit differently, but if you have a savings account, if you have investments, if you have a rental property, the value of that property, those are all things that need to be included in this, not used in charitable activities, because if it's sitting in the bank, it's not doing charitable work. If it's sitting with your investment manager, it's not doing charitable work right now, and you just need to report that. And the calculation is fairly simple. Once you set it up, it's just going to keep working for you. So you take the start of the year plus the year prior and the average of those two, and then the start of the year and the end of the year and the average of those two. And that's your beginning and ending property not used in charitable activities. Disbursement quota is not a big concern for congregations. Generally, spending the money is not an issue. And you only have to spend 3.5% of what you receive. So this is a pretty low bar. You do, if you get money from another charity, then you also have to spend that in the year. But typically you've got that for a specific purpose, and that's not a problem. This is a little bit more detail on the disbursement quota, but again, this is probably not something that's ever going to be an issue for a congregation. Not normally struggling to spend it, normally struggling to find it. Make sure the T3010 is signed. If you're doing it online, the person who's hitting the send button is authorizing it. But if you're doing it on paper, make sure it is signed. They will return it if it's not signed. There's a spot there where you put the address for your books and records. Don't put more than one location. Pick the best one. Multiple locations confuses them, and you don't want to do that. So just pick wherever most of your accounting data, your paid invoices, those sorts of things are stored. There is a spot to put the person who's completed the information, if that's different from the person who's signing, and that might be, you might have your council person signing, you might be filling it out as the treasurer. If you're sending it out, well, if you're submitting it anyway, you've got the form, you need to have a copy of your financial statements. If you need to have the directors and trustees, and if you sent money to other charities, you need the T1236 for qualified donees. Once you have all of those things, then you've met the requirement. It's a good idea to have someone else review that T3010 before you submit it or send it in. I always have either the finance committee or council. I want them to look at it because at the end of the day, they are responsible for that information. I especially want them to review section C, and I especially want them to review their information on that, directors and officers. I want them to know it's being sent, and I want them to be overseeing that. Again, if you've got other groups that are kind of under your umbrella, even if they have their own bank account and kind of do their own thing a little bit separately, you need to be including them in your figures. And consistency is the most important thing. Whether you put it on which expense line you put it on is not bright lines. There's some judgment calls going on, but if you're consistent year to year, that's the most important thing. I rushed through that, but I think a lot of it was straightforward. Is there any questions, or does anyone have a specific situation that they wanted to ask about? Again, there's information on the CRA website. I personally think the CRA Charities website is fairly easy to navigate. I quite like it. And if you are forced to spend that time on the phone with CRA, I do find that the charities director makes a lot of effort to be helpful. They really do. They want to help. Your biggest hurdle is probably going to be if you're not one of the people they have on their list as being an authorized person, then they might not be able to discuss any specifics with you, but they can still give you general information. Feel free to contact me. I will try to help as much as I can. And if that means doing some web search or something, I will absolutely help you do that. A few things to touch on as far as payroll. The taxable benefit can sometimes be confusing. You need to figure out, do the calculation of the taxable benefit for each of your employees every year, because it's not anything you will find anywhere other than doing the calculation. GSI has a worksheet for you, but you have to do that calculation. It's not on the GSI invoice. It's not anywhere else you can look. You need to know it. You need to add it in when you're calculating deductions. You need to report it in box 14 and box 40 of the T4. When the new plan came out last year with the different levels, if you have someone who's paying to bump up a level, that's considered a medical expense that they can potentially deduct on their income tax. And you can put that in box 85 for them. So that is very easy for them to show that they've paid that medical expense. And the lifestyle spending accounts are great. Like that's a lovely benefit. It really is. But you're only going to find out that someone's used it when you get that report from GSI in February. So unfortunately, you can't do your T4s until you get those. And keep in mind that it's taxable, but it's not pensionable. If you report it as pensionable, you're going to get the peer report because you haven't sent CPP on it. And CRA is probably going to phone you and say, why is this taxable and not pensionable? And you'll have to explain it to them, which you can do, but just if you make sure that that box 26 is correct, just avoid that conversation. If you have someone you're paying who's not on payroll, but what you've paid them is more than $500 in a year, you still have to give them a slip. Now they have to report the income regardless of whether they get a slip. But if you're paying them more than $500 in a calendar year, you have to give them a slip. And that includes musicians or somebody that you're paying to do custodial or cleaning, or if you're paying someone to do the bookkeeping or the payroll, and that includes pulpit supply. So any of those things. These are not for employees again. This is just if they're not employees, but you've paid the individual more than $500 in the year. That report is also due to CRA by the end of February, just like with your T4s. Any questions on any of that, or does that spark anything that someone wanted to know more about? It's interesting that the people that come to webinars and want to learn are typically the ones who have already spent a lot of time learning and typically have a better handle on it, I think, even than most who are doing these sorts of things. How does an honorarium work? That is the type of thing that would go on a T4A. If you've paid them honorariums that total more than $500 in a calendar year, you issue a T4A. It's very similar to a T4 reporting, but it's much simpler because there's no deductions. Does that answer the question? Okay. Just a reminder, you have to keep books and records. Some things you have to keep forever. Some things like financial records, you typically only have to keep. And we typically simplify that and say 7 years. It's actually 6 years past the end of the year it applies to, but 7 years is a simple way to keep it. You do have to keep offering envelopes. There was a time you didn't have to, but you do. They're considered source documents now. All of those sorts of things you have to keep. You should know where they are. You should know they should be labeled. They can even be labeled with a destroy date if it's one of the things you don't have to keep forever. And don't keep them longer than you need to. So definitely keep them as long as you need to. And don't keep them longer than you need to. They have to be in Canada. You're a Canadian registered charity, you have to have your documents in Canada, which seems pretty simple. But if you're using a database like, say, Little Green Light or Power Church or something, it's probably on a US server. If you're using a Canadian database, that's fine. But if you're using a US database to do your donation receipts, keep track of your donations, you have to have a copy of that data in Canada. It doesn't meet the requirement if you've got it on their server, if they're in the United States. So something you might want to check into depending on what kind of software you're using. Again, if you have questions ever, like, it's easiest to drop me an email, and don't ever hesitate to drop me an email. I will get back to you. I'm in the office Wednesdays and Fridays. I'm not always on site, but again, I will return phone calls and I will try to help as much as I can. That's all that I have to share with you. So if there aren't any other questions, everybody can start their long weekend a little bit early. If there are questions, though, don't hesitate. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat as well. And again, if you have a specific situation, don't hesitate to contact me directly.
Thank you very much, Monica.
Oh, thanks, Bruce. All right, well, I will stop recording.